In our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga, we began last time the chapter titled The Soul and Nature. Before this, we have seen how Sri Aurobindo brings us to the complete experience of oneness and the sense of oneness that he aims to realize in the integral yoga is not a oneness withdrawn from the world, but the same oneness which you experience in the absolute, in the infinite, in the timeless, in the static Brahman, that same oneness to be experienced here in the world of form, in the world of movement, time and space. And that was the framework, the goal which was intended, of which we saw the finer nuances, that the aspect of the Sat, the aspect of the Chit, and the aspect of the Ananda, all three can be realized here in the world, in form. In the first paragraph of the chapter we are now reading, and which we studied last time, Sri Aurobindo reminds us of this and how the path of the integral knowledge gathers all the strands of our being into this universal oneness. And in this experience, in the new divinized consciousness, we have to experience the world the way the Divine Himself experiences and possesses the world. And also we have to know each thing in its absoluteness, both in itself as well as in its union with everything else. And all of these are aspects of the fulfillment of this oneness. But there is a further dimension which he now brings into the discussion. So far, the experience of the absolute, the experience of the infinity, was not seen in this domain of finites and relativities. What he shows, and this is what we read last time, is that even that absolute can come into this experience of relativities, that infinity can be experienced in these finite appearances. We saw two extraordinary statements that he makes. He says, the absolute is everywhere. He doesn't say the absolute is represented. He says the absolute is everywhere. In other words, everything that we experience, all the relatives, this flower is small, that flower is big, this is living material, that is stone as dead material, all the relativities are really the absolute itself putting forward a front, an aspect, except that we cannot see. We are busy looking at the relative appearance. The second extraordinary statement he makes is that every finite is an infinite. He doesn't say represents an infinite. Every finite is an infinite. This flower, as we saw last time, is in fact infinite. Infinite in its detailing. You could go on dividing it infinitely. We saw last time how you can map this simple flower to an entire galaxy in a one-to-one identity, or map it to the entire universe in a one-to-one correspondence. And one begins then to recognize, oh yes, every finite object is in fact an infinite. But we are so habituated, even hypnotized, to see only its limitation and finite appearance that we stop with that. But he says, just as the absolute is everywhere, it has to be seen and found everywhere. In the same way, every finite is an infinite and has to be known and sensed in its intrinsic infiniteness as well as in its surface finite appearance. The means to do this is what he subsequently describes. but that we should be able to, on holding the flower or seeing it or smelling its perfume, one should be able to perceive that intrinsic infinity which is within, as well as appreciate its finite appearance and play. And this is the direction in which the whole discussion and experience is leading to. He shows how at first you may start with what appears as an intellectual idea, something which has to involve the effort of the mind and its imagination, but very quickly it opens out to a deeper, diviner vision and sense. And in that, one begins to experience spontaneously a union with the thing which you are interacting with. This line, which we have read last time, is suggestive of something more. I reread the line. But so to know the world, that is, in everything in the world and the world itself, we should be able to experience the infinite and the finite. But so to know the world, so to perceive and experience it, it is not enough to have an intellectual idea or imagination that so it is. A certain divine vision, divine sense, divine ecstasy is needed, an experience of union of ourselves with the objects of our consciousness. In that experience, not only the beyond but all here, not only the totality, the all in its mass, but each thing in the all becomes to us ourself, God, the absolute and infinite Satchidananda. And so this is the direction in which we have to increasingly grow, for which small steps we can begin to make as we are today, by dwelling on it with our mind, with our consciousness. And we saw a little bit of how this could be done last time. But here there's another suggestion. When he speaks of a certain divine vision, divine sense has to be activated. Those of you who are following our study of the Kena Upanishad and Sri Aurobindo's commentary will recall how the Kena begins with this idea. It asks the question, what is it in our seeing, what is it in our sight which is the actual seeing? That is, when you look at the flower, the science tells us that basically these are rays of light entering your eye. They are focused by the lens, they are projected on the retina. The retina cells convert the light into electrical signals, they go into the brain, they are processed as a pattern of electricity. But where is the seeing taking place? If you take a video camera, it does exactly the same thing. The light goes, is converted into electrical signals, is processed. But does the camera ever say, I see flower? It only registers the pattern of dots of light. You store the pattern of dots of light on a card, you transmit the pattern of dots of light, project it on a screen, but when the human being looks at the screen, it says, this is flower. Interesting. What is it happening inside us that makes us capable of seeing not just dots of light, but flower? Those of you who remember the good old days of television, which was broadcast with a weak signal, the picture would become grainy, it would become black and white sometimes, but you still knew what you were seeing. It's fascinating to see how even a grainy picture is enough to evoke in you the sense of recognition and even the sense of appreciation. And how does it happen? What in your seeing is the sight, really? It's not happening here. We might say it's happening in the brain, but even in the brain you're only processing electricity. My computer processes the signal which is being transmitted right now through the internet, but the computer is not seeing it. The seeing is taking place in us in a part that is capable of seeing. The sight is only a converter of signals, of light into electricity. The brain is a processor of electrical signals, but the seeing is taking place in the mind. In the yogic knowledge, therefore, we call the mind the sixth sense. Not only is it the mind which sees, it is the mind which hears. Even our ears are only processors. All of our physical senses are only machinery feeding through brain to mind. The mind seeing is recognizing. But the question of the Kena is a little deeper. Recognizing that it's the mind which is seeing, what in the mind is the actual sense of sight? What gives to the mind the capacity to see and know flower, world, color? In going deeper into this question, you could ask yourself, why is it that all of us see this flower as yellow? In each one of us, the retina is differently arranged. The cells are differently arranged. They have been differently tuned. Even the genetics is different. The electrical bundle of nerves going to the brain is differently structured. The brain cells are different. And they have changed across throughout our life from childhood. And yet all of us have consistently the same experience of seeing this color as yellow, or that as pink, or this as white. Why is that? Science doesn't have an answer. These are such fundamental questions against which science fails. Because the answer is not in the process and machinery of nature, it is in the thing that sees through our mind. The one that's actually seeing knows this as yellow and sees it as yellow. But how is it still the same for all of us? Because the one that sees is the same in all of us. And this is the great insight that comes from this deeper introspection of yoga, that all of us seeing this flower with different machinery, the actual perception of sight is the same in each one of us, because the actual seeing is being done by a consciousness which is universal, of which our minds are special focal points. Because that one consciousness is seeing this as yellow, as flower, so in each of our minds the sight recognizes this as yellow and as flower. And so when the Kena Upanishad asks, what is this sight of our sight, or hearing of our hearing, or even mind of our mind, we are forced to look up to something which is a greater knowledge, a greater mind, a greater sight, a greater sense, but which is not disconnected from our limited knowledge, mind, sight and senses. It is a continuum. It is that embedded in your mind which is the seeing. Now this is extremely important, because it means that potentially all of us have the capacity to be able to shift our seeing from here to that. And by a certain process of introspection, self-observation, and even a kind of a internal experimentation or adaptation or exploration, one is able to shift the seeing into this deeper, truer, larger seeing. And we discover at that point that we are not really bound to these eyes or these senses and their machinery. One can see from there directly, even bypassing the physical machinery. And that seeing, that sight can turn to look at anything, anywhere, even across great distance or across time. When that faculty operates directly, we call it parapsychological phenomena or psychic phenomena. It looks magical, but actually it is that same sense currently operating through your mind, plugged into the physical biology. And because it has limited itself to this channel, we call it normal. In fact, this would be abnormal, seen in a different way. To be bound and limited in a little pocket is abnormal. To be free and seeing directly should be normal, isn't it? There are many interesting examples in history of cases where that faculty operated normally, directly. One such example, I believe it is during the Second World War, it was extensively documented by the medical faculty in France. This was a man who was physically blind, and yet he could see. All he had to do was, turn his physical eyes in whatever direction he wanted. All medical knowledge showed that his biology was not functioning for the sight, and yet he could see, except when he got angry, when he got upset. When he was emotionally disturbed, there was a kind of a clouding and he became blind. When his mind was clear and calm, he could see. And it shows you how the actual power of sight is not really dependent on this. It is dependent on the state of consciousness. And when that is disturbed, there is a clouding. But this suggestion here is very important. It points to the fact that as we begin to shift in this way, we begin to perceive the deeper underlying reality, the sense of the absolute or the infinite behind the finite and relative appearance. There is this higher faculty, this higher direct seeing power within us, which begins to see more and more. It is that which brings into our sight the true seeing. And so he says a certain divine vision, divine sense, even divine ecstasy is needed. And with that comes the sense of the union. Even as you experience the flower, you feel it a part of yourself or yourself a part of it. The sense of a deeper connection which comes as the mind operates more from the higher and intuitive consciousness. There's a third important thing which came also in our study last time. The fact, he says, that this seeing, this experience of the underlying sense of absolute or infinity, the sense that this is ourself, this is God, the absolute, infinite and Satchidananda, that perception or the seeking for that perception, this is the secret of complete delight in God's world, complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will, complete liberation of the consciousness. And we dwelt on this last time. We dwelt on this extensively to see how these deeper yearnings within us are fulfilled when we begin to experience the world in this depth. And he points out that this is the supreme experience at which art and poetry and all the efforts of subjective and objective knowledge and all the desire and effort to possess and enjoy objects are trying to arrive, more or less obscurely, to this experience, to this perception of the underlying divinity in things and as things. Our first effort to seize the form is only a first movement. Here I want to grasp the flower, the form of the flower. In evolution, this is the first stage of the development. But now the evolution pushes us deeper to grasp that which inhabits the flower, the presence of the divinity, which gives you the deepest satisfaction. By seizing perfectly and absolutely, they get the sense of the infinite reality of which these are outer symbols. Here again, there is a very important suggestion that we need to explore. If this is the goal of all art, of all poetry, of all objective knowledge, of all subjective knowledge, and even of all attempt to desire and possess things, then can we consciously turn our efforts of art, poetry, knowledge and desires in this direction? How would that be? What would that be like? And I will jump to a previous portion of the synthesis of yoga where he has discussed this. And it is worth it in this context to look at that before we proceed. In the Yoga of Divine Works, Sri Aurobindo describes this process here. process of how everything, the perception of how everything is part of a overall movement of sacrifice growing towards the divine. But what happens when one orients oneself into that? Everything is done as a movement of sacrifice and consecration to the one divine. What happens then? For all must be done as a sacrifice. All activities must have the one divine for their object and the heart of their meaning. If this is going to be our approach, what happens? He says, the yogin's aim in the sciences that make for knowledge should be to discover and understand the workings of the divine consciousness puissance in man and creatures and things and forces, her creative significances, her execution of the mysteries, the symbols in which she arranges the manifestation. Without going too much into the detail, the idea is this, that when you approach the sciences and the seeking for knowledge, currently the whole effort or the presumption of science is that nature has a certain process based on certain laws, and we are discovering those laws, we are seizing from nature her secrets, we are then applying those laws and those secrets to do what we want. This is the way science works. Underlying this is an assumption that somehow those laws were there from the beginning and they make things happen the way they happen. And we formulate or articulate those laws in formulas. The reality, when we go deep enough, and that's where science falters, the reality as we go deep enough, we realize that all matter is energy. Energy is flowing in certain ways which we describe through the formulas. But if you go a step further, we discover all the formulas break down. There is uncertainty, there is almost something which is chaotic. There is chance operating and the laws seem to break down. If you go deeper, you discover your intention, your consciousness and its orientation modifies the results of your experiment. And at that point, science stops and refuses to go further. But if you did go further, and this is what the rishis did, the yogis did, they went deeper and found the energy itself is conscious energy, Chit Shakti. Conscious energy, being conscious, utterly conscious, and energetic as consciousness, is flowing, is whirling, is creating all these forms and patterns and rhythms across the whole universe. One energy, one consciousness, pouring out infinitely diverse worlds and movements. But because it is one energy moving in infinite worlds, you see a consistency in the play across the universe. That consistency which you see, the scientist says, this is a law of nature. But from a yogic perspective, we will say, no, who made the law? No one is there to impose the law. It is a free play of the creative energy, of the divine. Free play meaning there is no compulsion, there is no binding. It is not law, it is free expression. But because that free expression is seen by the scientist consistent across the universe and consistent across a long span of time, he says there must be some law which makes it happen. Because the starting assumption was this is all unconscious. The moment you see all this as conscious energy of the divine playing, what do you recognize? Delight and play of delight of energy, freely unfolding itself. Now in this vision, what happens to the scientist then? Are we busy looking at laws and discovering laws? No. What happens here is discover and understand the workings of the divine consciousness power. She is playing out in this way, and let's see how she plays. Discover, because she has veiled herself through many layers. Discover and recognize what's the play she's using and understand how she's playing, and then in man, in creatures, in things, in forces. So these are basically 4 levels at which the pursuit of science goes, in the psychological all the way down to the physical. And then her creative significances. You see, by whirling her energies in a certain way, she has produced this appearance of a flower. If the physical scientist observing the flower says it's made of molecules, made of atoms, made of subatomic particles, which are whirls of energy. If you look bottom up, it is conscious energy whirling, 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 creating foam of appearance, eventually to form the flower. So what do you see? The same energy forming the flower is the energy forming the table, is the energy forming the metal, is the energy forming air. The same energy with the same density and intensity. But she produces flower here, she produces tree here, she produces butterfly here. What do you recognize as difference between them? The meaning that she puts into these things. The energy is the same, the working is the same. So what he's saying is here is her creative significances. What is she signifying? What is she giving meaning to in that movement of the whirl of the play? Her execution of the mysteries, how she manages to execute these patterns to produce these outcomes. The symbols in which she arranges the manifestation. Each thing we discover is symbolizing some intention, some power of consciousness which the energy is organizing and representing, and it's arranged in a certain way. If you look at the tree, very interesting observation that comes. The overall shape of the tree is replicated in the overall shape of the leaf. A tree which spreads out broad and circular will have leaves which spread out broad and circular. A tree which is long and thin will have leaves which will be long and thin. Strange? Why should that be? There is a certain arrangement, a pattern, and the pattern is signifying something, relating something. Increasingly, science is recognizing these patterns, and we see that the universe is fractal. The large is represented in the small is a replica of the large, and infinitely mirroring and representing itself and playing it out. Why? Science doesn't know why. But here we have an insight that it's the free arrangement of the creative Shakti for the play of her delight, and she uses these symbols and arranges them to represent her mood, her state. Now when you start looking at the world in this way, you begin to relate to the world and to nature very differently. Let's say now you have the beginning of spring. It's not so sharp here, but when you move to higher latitudes, the variations of the seasons become more distinct. As you have the beginning of spring, suddenly all over nature there's the shift in the mood. There's a brightness, there's a chirpiness, there's a lift of the mood, and suddenly the birds start singing, the trees are happier, the flowers are glowing, and everything changes. What actually shifted? It's not because the temperature changes and the birds sing that you feel the lift. Rather, the lift of the energy of nature's mood is making the birds sing and the flowers to bloom and the plants to grow. What is happening is the mood that nature expresses is represented and symbolized in those forms and functions. You see, now we are beginning to look at reality inside out rather than outside in. The bursting out of an entire galaxy is a mood of nature to play out and play with certain forms and patterns of her consciousness and her delight. In a different galaxy, it will be a different mood of her delight. So, within the same galaxy, within the same little solar system, the mood that she creates for the Earth is different from the mood that she expresses in Mars or in Venus or on the Moon. And accordingly, the life forms on these planets are expressive of that mood. And the trees, even the bacteria, but the trees, animals, whatever grows, will reflect and express that mood. And for Earth, it is this mood, which makes for the forms. So you see, everything is seen now inside out the symbols in which she arranges the manifestation and her execution of the mysteries, the chains which she builds the form representing those moods. If you observe in the single cell of our body, there are complex chains of proteins which are created. And the more deep we go into them, the more complex we discover they are. In the more recent knowledge, we discover, for example, the chain by which from the DNA and RNA a new protein is synthesized. The chain is so complex, if you had to map it out on a piece of paper, it would be several meters square. Complex chains of patterns, all interdependent, interweaving to create finally a particular protein pattern, which has a particular quality of consciousness and quality of expression. And that whole complex thing is taking place inside each cell. And that complex thing is all the time modifying itself and playing. You cannot reduce it to a single formula. You can only recognize that there is a play of joy, of delight, of a free consciousness, choosing to limit itself in a narrow groove for a particular outcome, following a natural sequence. And so the scientist really ends up observing, describing, and then perhaps utilizing that knowledge. But the starting recognition is that there's a conscious energy working freely. So the whole goal of the scientist now shifts, and the relationship shifts. One of the implications of the relationship would be, if it is a conscious power working, how does it relate to our consciousness? Can my consciousness, which is also a part of my cells, engage with the consciousness working in the cells and modify them? And we discover, yes, it does work. Not only that, but we can enter into the cellular processes and modify them by willing directly. And many possibilities then emerge, even the possibility of reshaping inside out the full working even of our cellular consciousness, awakening them, even divinizing them. All of these become possible. But their first stages can be and have been tested in the laboratory, and one can therefore prove that this is in fact so. But this is only in the knowledge, in the domain of sciences that make for knowledge. What is the yogin's perspective of other areas? He says next, the yogin's aim in the practical sciences, now you're applying that knowledge, whether mental and physical or occult and psychic, should be to enter into the ways of the divine and his processes, to know the materials and means for the work given to us, so that we may use that knowledge for a conscious and faultless expression of the Spirit's mastery, joy and self-fulfillment. Continuing from the earlier picture, the consciousness is working to express things. If we can enter into that process, we can actually assist it, make it more perfect, make it faultless to express what it wants to. And the scope is not only mental and physical, but also the deeper occult and psychic domains. All of these are part of a larger practical science. How can you utilize it to make this manifestation perfect? And then the third area he speaks of, the yogin's aim in the arts should not be a mere aesthetic, mental or vital gratification, but seeing the divine everywhere, worshipping it with a revelation of the meaning of its works, to express that one divine in gods and men and creatures and objects. What does the artist do? The artist looks at this scene, that event or a mood, and then tries to express something of that which is experienced, but which goes beyond the merely visible. Sri Aurobindo explains that if the goal of art was simply to replicate what is already there in nature, you would take a photo. No, the artist draws out more than what is seen. because the artist has to first perceive something more and then draw it out, and in the painting it hits you. That ability to draw out what is hidden. And what is it that is hidden is the one divine. Worshipping it with a revelation of the meaning of its works, seeing the divine in everything and then drawing it out. Some aspect, some power, doesn't matter. But the more close you come to drawing out something of that which is hidden, the more powerful, the more complete and purposeful your art is. And he explains how this works. And the more wide, the more complete you're seeing, the more complete the expression, the more perfect and powerful and deep and luminous will be the art that springs from the high motive, and so on. The whole point is that the yogin approaches the whole experience from a higher consciousness, achieving therefore much greater results in all these fields. So I come back to the text now, and we jumped out from it only because he pointed to how all art and poetry and all effort of knowledge or possession and satisfaction are really aiming towards this glimpse of the divine. There was one last comment, one last observation which needs further comment. He said, when we have an experience of this deeper reality, we have the proof of it is in the glimpse of illumination and absolute satisfaction that we have. This was so fulfilling. And you don't get that any other way except by this glimpse. Because he says, we get by that a ray from the higher consciousness and the diviner sense into which our subjective being is intended eventually, if we will only allow it to be transfigured. And this, I touched upon it last time, but it needs a little more elaboration. The idea that this glimpse we have is natural to a higher consciousness which is ours. And our normal state of awareness is intended to be transfigured into that higher sense, into that higher consciousness and diviner sense. Intended if we will only allow it. And the suggestion is what prevents us from having that experience is our refusal of it. And we need to understand why. Where is this refusal coming? And because we may, on the surface at least, be yearning for it, and yet we don't get it. I'll go back to a different approach of logic to this. If everything in the universe is ultimately an expression of a divine consciousness, a divine energy, a divine delight wanting to play and express itself, then everything should be expressing it, or rather expressing it should be easier than not expressing it, right? If our own consciousness is a part of the divine consciousness, and the divine consciousness is infinite and all-powerful, and our consciousness is finite and limited, then the all-powerful should be able to just break through, and it should be the easiest thing to discover it. Or rather, it should be difficult to prevent it from blasting through, isn't it? What is it that prevents? And we observe that very early on, there is a conscious effort in the divine intention to narrow the focus and to lose itself in the play. To the point where the self-loss enters a degree that it forgets its divinity, forgets its origin, forgets its oneness, and is lost in a mechanical movement. And that's how matter emerges first. And from matter, basically, the process of awakening is the return journey or the awakening of that consciousness. We are now half awake. We are conscious that we are conscious. But we are not conscious truly of what we are. We are half awake. And at that point we can say, yes, I understand that is what I am, but I don't experience it, and I want to experience it. Still, what prevents it? And we discover that behind this limited experience we have is a whole momentum and habit going back. Not only from the time we are born, but in the very material with which we are born. So going back in our heredity all the way to our animal origins and the animal instincts. In the very act of entering the biology and identifying with the body, we are binding ourselves to that long habit of the body to feel itself small, insecure, limited and separate. And having entered it and identified with it, suddenly we feel, oh, but how can I be that? I am this. Now, if somehow one is pulled out or one is released from this narrow identification, the first reaction is, oh, I'm going crazy. Oh, I'm losing myself. Oh, I will die. And you shrink back. That instinct, that habit, that fear is what binds us. You will remember the incident, Sri Aurobindo narrates, when somebody came to him, and this was in the early years before the ashram was formally established. He would meet people freely. Somebody came and said, I want to have experience of the silence of mind. And Sri Aurobindo was sitting with the newspaper, and he said, sit down there. And he went on reading his newspaper, but he put his imprint of the silent mind on that man. After a while, the man began to get nervous. He got restless, and then suddenly he jumped up and said, I'm going mad, and he ran away. And Sri Aurobindo comments saying that this is what happens if the experience is given prematurely. What would be the normal slow process? A little bit, and then a little bit, and a little bit. The word Sri Aurobindo uses in this book, he uses a modicum, a tiny bit. Human nature is happy with gaining a tiny little bit, a modicum of joy, a modicum of freedom, a modicum of awakening of consciousness, and then we are satisfied, we feel safe and secure. Too much and we feel overwhelmed, or we feel we are going to lose what? Ourselves, meaning our narrowness. The experience of the ego meeting the infinity is often accompanied with a sense of fear. And the fear is dissolution of my narrowness, of my separateness. And if you have had repeatedly contact or approaching that experience, then you've prepared yourself, you've habituated yourself, and you're ready for it. Otherwise, the experience coming prematurely, you actually shrink back and lock yourself in harder, perhaps. And so this is the problem we face. If only we will allow it. This is what is waiting for us to experience in a transfigured consciousness. There is a aphorism of Sri Aurobindo along these lines. If mankind could but see, though in a glimpse of fleeting experience, what infinite joys, what perfect forces, what luminous reaches of spontaneous knowledge, what wide calms of our being lie waiting for us in the tracts which our animal evolution has not yet conquered, we would leave all and never rest till they had gained these treasures. So, in our own consciousness, in our own higher parts, which our animal evolution has not yet accessed, are these infinite enjoyments, perfect forces, luminous reaches of spontaneous knowledge, and wide calms of being. Exactly all the things which we are seeking in life, isn't it? And we are seeking them precisely because they already belong to us in these higher parts. And because they belong to us, we have something like a distant memory that this should be so, but we don't have it. And so we get restless saying, but I want this. But I can say I want this because something in me knows the this which I want. When you say I want perfect peace, implied is that somewhere within you, you know what perfect peace will be like. If you didn't know, how could you even ask for it? Isn't it? And these are those higher parts which our animal evolution has not yet awakened to and developed. They lie waiting for us in the tracts which our animal evolution has not yet conquered. Meaning, in those higher parts, the consciousness is, here I am, come on, open yourself, waiting. The implication is that if we were to consciously open ourselves, it would happily pour itself into us. And if you notice, this is exactly what Sri Aurobindo asks in the practice of the integral yoga. In the very basic practice of the meditation, he speaks of two things. He says there is the lid above the head which separates us from these higher parts. There is a veil over the heart which closes us from the deeper divine presence. And the first focus is open the veil, remove the lid. And the rest of the process happens because it then begins to pour, it descends, it settles, it reshapes and recasts your whole consciousness. The process, when thus approached, in fact is extremely simple and easy. It does not require strong, laborious, struggling efforts. Rather, it requires a trust, self-giving, and a conscious, even if gradual, opening to that which is waiting. And he says, if we had even a glimpse of that and an experience of it, we would leave everything and not stop till we had found it. So what prevents us, he writes, I'm reading the rest of the aphorism, but the way is narrow, the doors are hard to force, and fear, distrust, and skepticism are there, sentinels of nature, to forbid the turning of our feet from her ordinary pastures. So they are like the gatekeepers of nature, preventing us from wandering too far out from our narrow little penned space, limited space. Fear, distrust, skepticism. You saw what happened in the case of the man who was given first experience of the silence of mind. Fear, I'm going mad, and he ran away. Distrust is the second one, where, but what if I try? Will it happen? Will there be this experience? Can it happen? And skepticism, it's not possible. These are all dreams. I had an experience, but perhaps it was my imagination. How often we use this phrase, or we hear it even. Perhaps it was my imagination, but I felt something like this. No, it was not your imagination. Sri Aurobindo's reference for that is very simple. He says, if it is your imagination, you should be able to recreate it at will. Imagine an elephant. There, at will, I created an elephant in my mind. No, that's not the same thing you can do. Imagine the sense of infinity or the ananda. You cannot imagine it. You can recall an experience and call it back. But the experience is a thing in itself, not a creation of the imagination. So the fear, distrust and skepticism are there, sentinels of nature. But what is the truth is that all these things are waiting and are intended eventually to be our normal state. So a higher consciousness and a diviner sense, which are our own higher parts. Now we continue with the text proper into the next paragraph, where this experience of perceiving the divine, and particularly the aspect of the absolute and the infinite, which he says we should be able to experience in this finite form and world of relativities. He says, this perception of the infinite or the absolute, normally for us, is something which we hold outside the world. We have seen that this applies to the highest principles of the divine being. Ordinarily, the discriminating mind tells us that only what is beyond all manifestation is absolute. Only the formless spirit is infinite. Only the timeless, spaceless, immutable, immobile self, in its repose, is absolutely real. And if we follow and are governed in our endeavor by this conception, that is the subjective experience at which we shall arrive. All else seeming to us false or only relatively true. Now this is really the approach of most of the existing systems of yoga, philosophy or religion. They start with this idea that the absolute necessarily cannot be in the relative. Infinity must necessarily be outside the whole domain which is finite. So let's see what are the things he picks on. And each of these is worth dwelling on. First, the approach which sees this is the discriminating mind, the mind that separates and breaks up. It says only what is beyond all manifestation is absolute, because the moment you move into manifestation, the moment you become many, you have many flowers, you will always have relativities. How do you get to the absolute? You abstract from the flowers. The idea of flower, that is more absolute, isn't it? So let's say we have here 3 different types of flowers. Let's take the idea of this flower is absolute. Comparatively, it's a relative absolute. And all the flowers of this species are somehow included in the idea of this flower, to which you give a name. Whereas the idea of the other flower, again, each flower is different, but the common feature of all these flowers is the name you give to that particular species of flower. Taking these 2 absolutes or relative absolutes of flowers, of types or species of flowers, we construct a more essential idea: flower. A flower. And this is an idea which includes all these different species of flowers, absolute idea. You see how we are abstracting to construct something, but when you say a flower, do you have a picture? A flower which includes all ideas of every possible species and every type of flower in each species. You can't make a picture of it. It is necessarily not manifested. It is outside manifestation as an abstract essential idea. And that's how our mind looks at the absolute. And the moment you give it a form, the form is relative. Now there will be another flower in relation to it. This will be larger, this will be smaller. But the pure idea of flower is neither large nor small, nor bright nor dark. It is everything included, but none of these forms. That's how we have seen it. But we could also see it differently. We could say every flower of every species is an expression of this. And therefore that, or this is in each. When I lift up this flower, I see not only this form, but the pure idea of this species is also here. The pure idea of all flower, the essential idea that is flower, is also here. And even that it is that idea which is expressing itself as this species and as this flower. And with the mind, a little bit of effort, we can begin to see things like this. And this changes the perspective. The second example he gives is, the discriminating mind says, only the formless spirit is infinite. The moment you have a form means boundary, which means limit, finite. Try to conceive of something which is infinite. You have to keep widening it until you lose all sense of boundary, and boundary is gone. Then only it becomes infinite, and then it's lost form. How can form be infinite? Difficult. You can play with this a little bit with mathematically. Let's say draw a line which goes infinitely one side and infinitely in the other side. Yes, here you have a form that is infinite. But the line, is it a form? No, it's an abstraction. It's an idea of a form. The moment you bring it into reality of form, there will be somewhere, some boundary, somewhere on some side. Even if it is a long infinite rod, there will be a boundary on an edge. And so this is how the dividing mind looks at it. But now look more deeply. All form can appear only in a container which is infinite. If you have a container which is infinite, every possible boundary is included in the infinity. The infinite, as we saw last time, can map itself one-on-one on the shape of the form. We saw last time, here you have infinite dots, here you have infinite dots, and you can map them one-on-one. That is, the infinity which is large, the infinity which is small, and the infinity which is unending out there can be mapped. And they are equivalent. And somewhere the mind says, yes, that's true. But it's not used to thinking like that. So what he's saying here is, we can reverse this. We can begin to see all forms as mappings or limited appearances of something which is infinite. We saw last time mathematically how you can map an entire unending line to a small segment, an entire surface or the whole 3D universe to one 3D object. And mathematically this can be proved. And that means this object is the whole universe representing itself in a finite appearance, is infinity putting forward a finite face. And we have to consciously retune our mind to begin to look at things this way. The third example he gives is, only the timeless, spaceless, immutable, immobile self in its repose is absolutely real. And where do we get this idea? If you look at the flower, what is its reality? It's a changing substance. It was born at one point, it's going to die eventually, and so it has no intrinsic reality. Its existence, its survival depends on the air, depends on the water, depends on the soil. What is absolutely real, meaning permanent, not dependent on anything else? Well, the first thing you have to do is, as soon as you're inside time, you have a process of birth and death. You have to get rid of time. It has to be timeless, otherwise it cannot be really real. Second thing you say, the moment it is in form, well, it has an origin and a limitation which can be broken, so you have to get out of space. The moment it is in movement and change, it is mutable, it is not going to be permanent. And if it is moving in any way, changing in any way, it's not real. And so he says, only the timeless, spaceless, immutable, immobile self resting. Even if it moves a little to express, it would not be real. At least that's the idea. And you will see most of the spiritual traditions aim at that as the real, and so the world is therefore unreal, very simply. But you can also reverse the process. You can begin to see how that which is underlying real is what moves and pours out to become the world. And then everything which it puts out, therefore formed out of itself, is as real as that. Though the appearance may be changing, the thing which forms it is real. So Sri Aurobindo has this very fascinating phrase in Savitri. He says something like this. I don't get the exact phrase now. This world is a dream fact real, which but for the dream would not be entirely true. It's a dream which is a fact of a reality. It's as if the divine dreams and forms out of himself in the dream, but as a fact, as a reality, because the divine is utterly real, everything he forms out of himself is utterly real, which but for the dream would not be entirely true. Similarly, in another text which we have seen earlier as the Upanishadic text that Sri Aurobindo wrote, he points out that the world is an expression of the divine and is as real as the divine from which it originates. And it is divine expression of a divine reality. Maybe I'll just read those lines because it's in the text which we have seen earlier referred to as Sri Aurobindo's Upanishad. He says, I just read the two lines from here. As the reflection of the sun is one in calm water, but multiple in restless water, real is the sun, real the reflection, the real light of the real sun. It is not a dream, but the light of a reality. Or as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its forces, as if running. Real is that light, the real luster of the real sun, that is not false shining. Or as the flaming disk of the sun is not the sun itself, but this material form only manifests the sunness of the sun to our knowledge. The sun is beyond the form, real is the sun, real is the form in the shape of the disk. It is the real light of the real sun. Not illusory, but the real light of a reality. In the same way, here the world Brahman is the true light of the divine, not a dream, nor illusory, nor a false shining. It is the real light of the reality. Not divine in himself, but still he himself only. This is the supreme Maya, this is the greatness of the yoga of the Lord of Yoga, Sri Krishna. This is his blissful Leela with his consciousness force. This is the inconceivable working of the Supreme. I've read through quickly, but the idea here, which goes back to the original Vedic conception, the world is a real expression of the underlying reality, not an illusion. The way we perceive it is illusory, but that's only because of our wrong perception. But the world itself is a real expression of that. Maya, the word used in the Veda, is based on the root sense Maya, which is to measure out. Measuring out finites out of something which is fundamentally infinite. Measuring out multiplicities out of something which is essentially one. And so it is a creative power, not an illusory power. In the later development of the yogic systems, the same term was used but with a bias in the other direction. If it is a creative power, the creative process conceals the underlying oneness, conceals the underlying absolute. And because it is concealing, it is a power of concealment, and later it was reduced to a power of illusion. The word Maya itself today is understood more in the sense of illusion, but originally is used in the power of creative expression, measuring out. But a magical creativity measures out impossibly what is otherwise one underlying infinity. So this is the sense we have here, that you could orient yourself to see that only that is real and all the rest becomes then illusory. And if you orient yourself like this, Sri Aurobindo says, that's the way you will experience the divine. And this is the most important principle here. If you approach the divine by predefining your conception of the divine as silence, unchanging stillness, well, that is what you're focusing on and that is what you realize. Because everything else you have eliminated in your experience of divinity by saying it is not a divine. So you have created a false or limited conception of divinity and then pushed yourself to experience only that with the exception of everything else. Obviously, the divine being equally universe, if you have eliminated universe from your concept of the divine or absolute, then you have eliminated a part of the divine itself and your experience is limited. So Sri Aurobindo says, if we start from a larger conception, a completer truth and a wider experience open to us, we perceive that the immutability of the timeless, spaceless existence is an absolute and an infinite, but also that the conscious force and active delight of the divine being in its all blissful possession of the outpourings of its powers, qualities, self-creations, is an absolute and an infinite. And indeed the same absolute and infinite. So much the same that we can enjoy simultaneously, equally, the divine timeless calm and peace and the divine all-possessing joy of activity, freely, infinitely, without bondage or the lapse into unrest and suffering. Now he has just made this statement. If we observe like this, this is what we will see. So now we need to explore this. How do we recognize this? First, we accepted the unchanging, timeless, spaceless existence is an absolute and an infinite. But that also the conscious force and active delight of the Divine Being in its all blissful possession of the outpouring of its powers, qualities and self-creations is an absolute and an infinite. How do we recognize this? You see the phrasing he has used. These are, when we are not used to these terms or these ideas, for a moment the mind goes, what's he talking about? But once you begin to dwell on it, you realize it's a very precise language leading you to the experience. What's he saying? The possession of the outpouring of its powers and qualities and self-creations. When the energy pours out of the divine to become the universe, what is its relationship with the divine? The divine holds the energy, like a vessel holding the waters that pour through it. If there's a river flowing, the ground that supports the river is possessing the river. If there's an ocean flowing, then there is the underlying base which holds the ocean together. So when the whole universe pours out in the Big Bang, it becomes that which holds it all together is absolute, isn't it? The play of the relativity is taking place, but the containing consciousness is absolute. It never changes. The content of the universe may change form infinitely, but the container which holds the universe is still absolute. And what is this container like? The container is the conscious force and active delight of the Divine Being in its all blissful possession. The one who is possessing is conscious force, active delight and blissfully possessing. And what is it pouring into? Its own consciousness, its own force and its own bliss. So now you can look at it two ways. The containing consciousness, force and bliss is absolute, into which it pours all its relative play. But who is enjoying is still absolute. What is it enjoying? The full play of the relativity. And who is pouring into it? The same container. And so what you find here is, we had an artificial division between the flowing water and the container. Now we realize it is the same consciousness, force and delight which is flowing inside, which is also containing it. Meaning every little stream inside the flow is contained and enjoyed with its absolute consciousness, which is flowing inside. You cease to have this distinction between a container static against which the flow takes place. It is the same thing which flows, which is also standing back and holding and containing. So you see, the language catches this experience. We perceive also the conscious force and active delight of the Divine Being in its all blissful possession of the outpouring of its powers, qualities, self-creations, is an absolute and an infinite. As it possesses this pouring out, it is still absolute. In the tiniest detail, the flower held in this containing consciousness, the containing consciousness is still absolute, even if the form of the flower is playing in the relativism. So where is the absolute? Right here, holding the flower while it plays with the relativity. And you do not need to step out of time and space to know the Absolute is embracing every tiny part of space and time. And this is now changing our vision of the whole universe and of the relationship with the Divine. And indeed, the same Absolute and Infinite, so much the same that we can enjoy simultaneously, equally, the Divine timeless calm and peace and the Divine time-possessing joy of activity freely, infinitely, without bondage or the lapse into unrest and suffering. So we can hold that poise where we enjoy the Divine freedom, and then we can hold this also, the container holding this play right here in the finite form and play. So the Divine time-possessing joy of activity. It possesses time, it possesses relativity, it possesses finiteness from its consciousness which is absolute and timeless and infinite. So the Divine time-possessing joy of activity we can have. And when we have that, are we bound in that? Remember, earlier we have discussed how entering the form, identifying with the form, I am body, I have desire, I need this, I am bound. But when your consciousness is thus liberated and it now recognizes this body and this object and everything possessed by this Absolute, and your basis is on the Absolute possessing the time, you can enjoy the time experience and not be bound. This is the point he is getting to. We can enjoy simultaneously, equally, the Divine timeless calm and peace and the Divine time-possessing joy of activity freely, infinitely, without bondage or the lapse into unrest and suffering, which would come if you had bound yourself only to the relative without this basis of the Absolute. And this is the direction with which we have to now re-embrace the whole world. Everything in the world, every experience is to be known as an expression of the Absolute playing, holding the relatives, as an expression of the infinite holding the finites. So too, we can have the same experience of all the principles of this activity, which in the immutable are self-contained and in a sense drawn in and concealed, in the cosmic are expressed and realize their infinite quality and capacity. So this is going to be the nature of the liberation with which the integral yoga aims to participate in the world. That this experience can be had in everything. Now, if it can be had in every form, it can also be had in every fundamental relationships. One and many, activity, rest. In each of the opposites which have formed the experience of the universe, we can find this Absolute in the relativity. And this is what he is pointing to. In the immutable, which is outside space and time, those principles are absorbed, concealed, drawn in. In the cosmos, they are expressed, but they are still operating as infinite quality, infinite capacity, infinite appearance. This has set the framework of what is going to follow next. Next, he will begin bit by bit, step by step, taking up the fundamental principles by which the whole universe is built. And these principles often appear in pairs or in opposites. And he will show how in each of these principles on all levels we can begin to perceive the active presence of the Divine, Absolute and Infinite in all forms and movements. The first principle which he takes up is the duality which resolves itself into a unity of Purusha and Prakriti. A static, unchanging consciousness and then a movement of energy expressing that consciousness and creating forms. The relationship between these two cannot be healed if you think about it logically. Something unmoving and something which is in constant movement. How can they ever be one? You can say there are two different aspects of the same one, but what would that same one be like? Again, the mind stops there. But all right, we accept this, we read the philosophy, we accept this is how it is. But how can you see it? How can you experience it? And this is the theme that he takes up in the next paragraph, which we will keep for next time. You see in these two paragraphs that we have studied, a very important shift that Sri Aurobindo sets before us in the way we conceive the world, in the way we can begin to perceive it, and in the way we understand the whole nature of the spiritual journey. Contrast this with the more conventional idea which simply says, the absolute is there, this is relative or this is unreal, get out of the unreal, get into the absolute, merge yourself, and the world is to be dissolved or abandoned or left to itself. And of course there is no question of a divine life. If we make this suitable correction in our perspective, we begin to see the absolute not only there in the static, but also here manifested in the relativities. We not only realize that the whole purpose of this creation is to realize and experience those infinities and absolutes in all the forms, but that is our deepest satisfaction, it is our deepest fulfillment. Then we are here for that satisfaction. We are here for that fulfillment. And our lives are not fulfilled if we have not consciously begun to experience this absolute infinite divinity in each form, through all forms, through all experiences, until our entire mind is satisfied, our heart is satisfied, our will is satisfied fully, and we live still in a freedom of the consciousness, experiencing the delight of the divine in the play. And this is the reason why the whole universe was manifested. This is the purpose for which we have entered into this play. And it is towards this that all of our evolution is leading us. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo calls the divine life on earth. It is the dream that every tradition or religion has had, conceived of some kind of an ideal state, some kind of a Vrindavan, some kind of a divine, eternal existence. Many of the religions pushed it after life in some other higher plane of consciousness. In the Christian tradition, they speak of the kingdom of God, but then there is one reference of the kingdom of God on earth. And Christ came to say, I am here to give you the kingdom of God on earth. And of course this whole thing can be understood politically and the whole point is lost. Or if you look at the Vrindavan, where Sri Krishna dances with the gopis, it is here on earth. But of course there is that Vrindavan there also, but to bring it on earth was his purpose, to manifest it in humanity. But it requires us to break out of our narrow consciousness and awaken to this underlying absolute behind all appearances of relatives. To begin to relate to it more and more directly, to be able to enjoy it more and more completely, is the whole further progress of our evolution. And then that consciousness which we have there and its bliss is now experienced in the play of multiple forms, making it more rich and more complete. And the world itself is then seen to be the body of God. And such is the experience of the supramental consciousness and the supramental world towards which we are evolving. This sets the base on which the rest of the several chapters, in fact, will build on. How does one increasingly grow into this realization? We can pause here and take up any comments or questions. Yes.
Sir, in Vedas, I have read that there are three things which remains always. One is matter, one is matter, other is soul, and the third is the supreme power. As you were telling in table also, there is his power. No, it is made by human beings. These souls have made it. The basic difference between matter is it always remains as the same in the physics is matter can never be created nor destroyed. And the second is, and it is Sat. And the soul is Sat and Chit. It is Chetan also and it is Sat also. And Ishwar, the God, is Sat, Chit and Anand. The three qualities are there in that superpower. So, as you were telling that it is there in this also, it is being made by the human beings. He has developed from the matter which is available to the man. So how do you say about this?
Sri Aurobindo uses a different terminology. You see, we tend to look at the universe or nature purely in terms of matter. Actually, the universe itself is made of many levels or grades of substance, not just material. You can dematerialize object, you can materialize, and so it will seem as if matter is created or destroyed. But we have to see the broader picture, nature. Nature is an absolute. Soul is an absolute and the divine is an absolute. So, Sri Aurobindo, in his very first page in the Life Divine, he speaks of these three: God, man and nature. These are the three things finally which we have to resolve and their right relationship. If we don't have the right relationship, then our life becomes futile or we go off track. When we put these three in their right relationship, then everything becomes meaningful and worthwhile. And we see it this way: there is only ultimately the divine. Nature is power of the divine flowing, manifesting the divine possibilities. And soul is a projection of the divine consciousness entering nature to experience and to enjoy this whole manifestation. So the divine in the totality enjoys the manifestation, embracing it from outside, but the divine also enters into the manifestation as if a projection or a limited part to enjoy from within the limitation that which is unlimited. And that limitation of the soul entering grows. And as it grows, it experiences all the possibilities of enjoyment and the colors of enjoyment at each step of its growth.
Who enjoys this?
The divine himself entering as soul.
But see the Prakriti nature, it cannot enjoy this table.
Exactly.
Doesn't have feeling.
Exactly. So it appears.
It appears only, but it doesn't have any feeling.
It appears to us that it is not enjoying. It appears as if the table has no feeling, because our perception of feeling is only through nervous systems. But the consciousness which fills and forms the table is utterly in bliss from inside. Every particle of the subatomic particles which form matter is nothing but Satchidananda concentrating on itself and losing itself in trance of its bliss, which becomes the separate particle, so to say. But when you have innumerable separate particles, each a focal point of the Satchidananda of bliss, you do not see the bliss expressed, it is concealed inside the particle. But because it is one Satchidananda, ultimately there is the memory of the oneness which brings the particles together, and the consciousness which is lost inside the bliss of the particle reaches out and connects to the consciousness of the other particle and forms a bond, joining, uniting, creating aggregates of particles until they form the atom. And the atoms, again, consciousness energizing, connecting, drawing each other, forms complex of atoms, molecules, and so on. But all the time inside, concealed behind the form and appearance, the bliss is immersed.
And it should have feeling also.
In everything,
It doesn't have feeling. If you tap it won't cry.
in everything,
It won't cry. If you just tap it won't cry. But
in
if you
everything,
tap to a human being, it will cry. So the difference between the two, this material and the human being.
yes, in everything the bliss enjoys, but it may not be able to express because the mechanism of expression is not there. If someone hits you, you cry out because you have a mechanism for a vocal expression. If your throat the vocal cords are not functioning, you cannot cry out, but you'll still feel the pain. You will feel the pain sensation as long as there's electrical signal. You remove the electrical signal, you will not register the pain, but the sensation there will still be there. You can take a plant, take a vegetable, you can wire it up electrically. And as you cut the vegetable, the electrical signals, if you amplify them on a loudspeaker, you will experience something which is like a grating sound, like a screech. Well, will you say the vegetable is experiencing pain and is calling out? It doesn't have vocal cords which are formed, but the electrical signals are indicating something is being experienced there. So if we go deeper into appearances, we discover in fact that all you find at lower levels is the power of expression is not developed, but the experience is still there. Now, for example, there's a series of experiments done with plants where the plant is wired up to what is called a lie detector. Basically, it measures the skin resistance of the plant. And there's a general random oscillation, lightly. The scientist in this case, one Baxter, he took a pair of scissors reaching out to cut one of the leaves. As he approached the leaf, there was a sharp reaction on the plant. So he said, I have not yet cut. How did it happen? Did the plant sense it? So he pulls back the scissors, it stops. He again approaches the scissors to check, no response this time. He again approaches, no response. So the plant obviously is not registering the scissors position. So, it must have been a freak. Let me go ahead and cut. And he approaches to cut, and immediately the plant shows a reaction again. Now you notice what was happening. When he pretended to approach the scissors, the plant was not reacting. When he decided to cut and was about to cut, the plant was reacting. So you see, the plant does not have eyes to register where the scissors are and whether the threat is there, but it has a sensational perception which is directly registering your intention towards it.
But will it have, while you cut the table, will you register the same feelings?
Here's the interesting thing. At least with a living plant, we are able to show that the plant responds to a pain sensation even more intensely than the human, and it retains the memory of the pain sensation. These are recent experiments. In fact, in the last 2 months, you'll find a lot of literature in this direction, that the plant remembers the pain sensation and actually modifies its responses subsequently because of the memory of the pain sensation. Once the plant has been cut, is dead, you do not have the same mechanism of response. But in the material, which is now so-called dead cells, there is still the underlying Satchidananda held inside, which registers and has its consciousness and response on its level. So let me look at this. The plant, because it doesn't have vocal cords, will not be able to speak, but it can still put out that response here, in this case, electrically. But if you didn't wire up the electricity, the response is still there, only you don't hear it. That's because you are deaf to it. But somebody else who senses the plant consciousness will register it. As an example, we had a case in the Castellini guest house in those days. It was a guest house, now it's a building. The owner, the person looking after it, looked at the tree, and one day, and the next day he has the mother call him. What happened? Last night she asked him, are you going to cut that tree? And the man said, no. So mother said, but last night the tree came to me and it was complaining that you're about to cut it. And then the man was sheepish. He said, yes, I was just thinking, I was standing in the garden, I was thinking, what if I cut the tree? There'll be so much more sunlight here. That thought is picked up by the tree. Now the tree cannot communicate with this fellow because he is deaf. He is blind. So he approaches the mother. The tree has enough consciousness, intelligence to recognize who's in charge and who can receive its response and make a complaint there. Right? Now, if you shut down the biological process of the tree sap, dry it out, the consciousness which inhabits is not gone. Its capacity to further express is more reduced. In the table, therefore, there is an impression and a registration and even a reaction. And it can be seen sometimes in its processes. One example I will give you. You take a piece of metal, let's say iron, maybe a knife or a keychain, take two of them, you put away one in the cupboard and another you keep with you and you use every day. Look at it, appreciate it. 3 months down, you take out the other one and compare. You will find in the other one a light coating of rust. The one which you have been using will probably not have any rust, although it is exposed much more to variation of climate. Why? The metal there feels itself unused, useless, lost in its purpose, and the consciousness is unhappy at not being used.
Because of that, you are cleaning it daily. That's the thing. You are not.
The one in the cupboard.
Because you have kept it.
True. There is that factor also. The one in the cupboard can be kept in an environment which is dust-free. Still, the process of rust formation is influenced by the consciousness that you put onto it.
Because of the oxygen available in the atmosphere.
Yes. But the oxygenation process is actually slowed down or speeded up depending on the consciousness of the thing. And again, these are measurable. As an example, you look at the work of one Emoto. This is a Japanese scientist who projects feelings onto water crystals and then photographs the water crystal. If you take a glass of water and stick on it an intention in a writing or articulate it with words, intentions which are positive make for the crystalline structure of the water to become more complete and symmetrical. The same water, if you project hatred towards it, the crystalline structure breaks down and loses symmetry. And these are visible physically in the structure. Obviously, in the chemical reactions of the water, there is a change. Now, these are minute but measurable. A person holding the water puts a negative intention, in the chemical reaction, there is a shift. How do you explain this?
So that is, if you take a stone, there should be some reaction to that.
Yes, but
If you are drilling a ball, there should be some reaction to that.
the reactions,
Since it doesn't have any sense, any feeling, it won't react to that one. There might be some experiments as you are telling. It has revealed few facts about the feeling.
but the claim you make that there is no reaction is wrong. There is a reaction, only you can say it is small enough that you cannot register it. With fine instruments, you are able to measure those responses and reactions. This is exactly the point. We are dumb, we are dulled to those finer reactions. But if you are able to open yourself on a subtler level, not only you will see, not only you will sense, you will be able to interact with the table consciousness, and it can reveal its knowledge to you. It can reveal things. You can take a handkerchief that a person has used. It is full of the vibes of the person. You can hold the handkerchief and describe the person's thoughts and feelings, if you are sensitive enough to feel those vibes. The handkerchief itself is a carrier and has become a part of that consciousness of the person. The same way the table, the same way a machine. Now, this is again a skill one can develop. You have a machine which is not working, let's say an electronic device or a mechanical machine. You approach it even without opening the machine. You can enter into the consciousness of the machine and it reveals to you what is out of order. And you can then intervene to correct for it. Very interesting experience people had. And so I'll share an example which took place. I was at one point exploring these things a little bit, and I spoke to somebody. We were working on a machine in the press, one of the the photo typesetting machine. And the person who was repairing it was the only person in the whole of India for repairing those Linotron machines. And he would be traveling every day, different cities, fixing those machines. And so we were discussing this thing, and he said, I had a very interesting experience once. He was going repeatedly to a particular press where the machine was breaking down. He would come there, he would test the machine, everything was fine. He would go away, and again he would get a call, the machine has broken down. He would come back, everything was fine, back and forth. Eventually they discovered that there was one particular operator. Whenever he came, the machine would break down. They dismissed the operator, and the machine never had a problem. And he said, I cannot explain this, except to recognize that there was an interaction taking place, not in the usage, because these things are hardy devices. You can even bang them, they don't break. Something to do with the man and the consciousness with which he was connecting to the machine was making the machine break down. And we could not find a physical defect. But it would break down whenever that operator was there. There are things like this, for example, which can be observed. The mother, when she came to the computer center of the ashram, this was in the very early days when they had first got some very basic electronic logic circuits. And they had an exhibition, and the mother came for that. And the people who observed the interaction, they said something went wrong, it wouldn't work normally. And the mother's comment afterwards to one of her attendants was, I was experimenting to see how this would respond to the new consciousness. So now, physical electronic devices which are logic based, they are tightly bound in the logic structures. She brought in her consciousness and to see how it responded, and it responded in a way totally different from the logic. So you are seeing an interaction between a higher consciousness and the physical consciousness of the object, which changes its physical properties and functions. Now all of this is in the domain of experience, though not of normal experience, because we operate with things in a very narrow band, with a very dull and limited consciousness. But if we can develop that perception, if we can develop that ability to connect, we feel that these things are living, they experience, they register, and they respond.
There are very few people of this higher consciousness, like Swami Dayanandji, who wrote Sanskar Vidhi. He was not married, but he has given such beautiful and very logic how to have a baby of his choice. So this is, he was not married. With the consciousness, he could write all those books and all those things. So there are very few people who can do as you are telling.
The point is not how many people have the capacity. The point is all of us can develop the capacity. And this is important, and we are intended to develop it by whatever means. That's the whole point of the yoga. We are at a very crude stage of evolution. And all of these things, infinite possibilities of experience, are waiting for us to be developed and to awakened. And the highest of this is the direct perception of the divine in everything. The perception of the infinite and the absolute in and behind every form. And relating to that divinity in everything. You hold the flower and you experience the most sacred experience of closeness and intimacy with the divine as this flower. Your entire heart opens out blissfully. Your mind perceives the infinity that this flower expresses in its finite shape. And your will is fulfilled in the sacred action of placing the flower before the Lord in the universe. It doesn't have to be before a deity form. Right here, I place it, and it is a sacred act. Every action becomes utterly sacred, filled with infinity and blissful, conscious awareness. This is the kind of experience that our evolution has to take us towards. A little bit of this, even a tiny, 1,000th, a millionth of it, is a drop enough to make the life worthwhile. And bit by bit one has to cultivate this in our activities of life. Every action, every activity has to be raised to become sacred. If you observe how happy a person is when they think they're doing something sacred. I went to certain temples where I saw people cleaning with great gusto and enthusiasm. They're doing some service to God. And it struck me, the space in their own house is also God's. And if they did it with the same enthusiasm and the same sense of sacredness and dedication, they would have exactly the same benefit. But we have somehow programmed ourselves to think God is there and not here. And so we miss the whole point of the experience. But can we consciously cultivate this? And the exercise begins with a small step. 5 minutes every day. You take up a little patch of your room's floor or table or an object, arrangement of flower, whatever it is, a simple activity which does not require too much intellectual involvement. Align yourself with the sense of the divine presence within you, the divine presence in the things which you will interact with. Put yourself as closely as you can to that, and then do the activity as a sacred offering to that divine presence. And with the idea that this is an expression of the play of the divine bliss working through these relationships. And just stay immersed in it for a few minutes. And it will be the acme of the day, the highest point of the day. After that you can move into any activity, lose yourself in any work, even if it's mechanical. But something of this touch will start coming in. And bit by bit you will find it popping up spontaneously in the midst of other works. You will remember this. It will happen spontaneously. And that joy will begin to fill. And the point Sri Aurobindo has made here, that this is the secret of complete delight in God's world, complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will, complete liberation of the consciousness. We'll pause in our study for today, and the next paragraph where he takes up the deeper appreciation of this principle of the duality of Purusha and Prakriti, and how underlying it is the divine absolute and infinity playing, that we will take up next Friday.